Are you constantly feeling tired or noticing ups and downs with your mood, maybe mood swings, or struggling with concentration? These are common symptoms that might actually be linked to something surprising, vitamin B1 deficiency. My name's Dr. Taranella, and in this video, we're diving into the often overlooked issue of thiamine deficiency, also known as vitamin B1 deficiency. Despite its critical role in energy production and overall health, this deficiency is more frequent and often missed or not even considered. So we're going to explore why thiamine is so important to your health and how common this deficiency is in certain populations and why you might want to consider looking at and testing your thiamine levels. All right, let's jump into the video. Before we jump into looking at how common thiamine deficiency is, first let's look a little bit about what thiamine or vitamin B1 is and also how we test for it. So vitamin B1 is an essential nutrient and it's essential for converting carbohydrates and other energy sources into more raw energy like ATP. So it plays a critical role in glucose metabolism, helping the cells of our body turn that glucose into ATP. It also does this with certain amino acids. Diagnosing thiamine deficiency can be a bit tricky though because the testing availability is somewhat limited. The gold standard for testing for thiamine deficiency uses a enzyme-based test that's looking for the activity of transketolase, and this is basically an enzyme that requires thiamine in order to work. Unfortunately, this test is not widely available anymore as it once was. So the next best option for testing for thiamine deficiency would be to measure thiamine levels in whole blood or in red blood cells. And that's why the most commonly used test when you're serious about looking for thiamine deficiency these days is going to use whole blood measurements, and it's going to use liquid chromatography and mass spec to determine what those thiamine levels are. In the US, the reference range at LabCorp for this whole blood thiamine test is 66.5 to 200 nanomoles per liter. For this test, the thiamine that's being tested or measured is thiamine pyrophosphate, which is also abbreviated TPP. And the TPP makes up almost 90% or the majority of circulating thiamine in the red blood cells. And just as an aside, your body does require ATP, which is energy, and also magnesium in order to make that TPP. Testing for thiamine deficiency can also be done in whole blood, serum, plasma, and urine. But the whole blood mass spec liquid chromatography measurement is the best option available. Serum testing is not that helpful and often yields false negatives or much higher values than what the red blood cell level would yield. So now that you know a little bit more about how to measure thiamine and how to define thiamine deficiency, let's look at how common thiamine deficiency is. And the first thing that often comes up when we're looking at vitamin deficiencies is what is the RDA? And the RDA is the recommended daily allowance. Really, the RDA is basically telling us how much you need to consume in order to not get sick from a vitamin deficiency. So the bar is pretty low. This is like the very minimum amount you need in order not to get sick, but it's not telling us what the optimal level is. So the RDA has been set at 1.2 milligrams per day, and this is really not a lot of thiamine. This is believed to be sufficient, again, to prevent disease. And despite many foods like breads and things being fortified with thiamine, the studies that I looked at for this particular video suggest that thiamine deficiency is not as rare as we might think, with reports of deficiency ranging from 10% all the way up to 90% in some populations. And still, the common belief is that thiamine deficiency is not that common. But let's take a look at some of these studies and some of these populations to see if we can yield a little more insight into this problem of thiamine deficiency. So several studies looking at preoperative bariatric patients, they evaluated to see how common thiamine deficiency was in these populations, and they found anywhere from 15% up to 29% of cases had thiamine deficiency, and these rates actually went up quite a bit after the surgery. Now, the increased rates after surgery is obvious because they're not consuming as much food and also likely have some compromised digestive capacity there as well. So the obvious implication here is that there's something going on with people that are overweight that's causing thiamine deficiency, but broader data on overweight populations is limited, but somewhere around 40% of adults in the US and worldwide are considered overweight by some standards. And so there's a potential for a pretty wide range of people having thiamine deficiency. Now, whether or not it's present in all overweight populations isn't clear, because when you're going in for bariatric surgery, you do have to limit your calorie intake. The idea is that you're going to lose weight, and there's usually some sort of mandate prior to doing bariatric surgery that you lose a certain amount of weight on your own prior to that surgery. And so that could be compromising some of this data as well. Let's look at another demographic here and see if we can gain some additional insight. Now, oftentimes when there is obesity or weight gain, it's commonly associated, or it's common to have insulin resistance or diabetes. There's some relationship there. And one study looking at this diabetic population found that the diabetics had a 76% lower levels of thiamine than non-diabetic controls. And so they may not have frank deficiency, but they may be on the lower end of the range there. Another study found that 98% of diabetic patients had thiamine deficiency, and they suggested that it was due to increased kidney excretion of the thiamine, but it could also be due to the increased carbohydrate consumption or increased carbohydrate load that is so common with at least type 2 diabetes. And the relationship there again is that, when you're consuming higher amounts of carbohydrates, you're going to demand more of that thiamine because it's needed for glucose metabolism. Thiamine deficiency can significantly affect the brain metabolism and influence mood, cognitive function, and also motivation. Despite that critical connection there, research in this population is somewhat limited, but one study looked at thiamine deficiency using the erythrocyte transketolase activity test that I referenced earlier. This is the more sensitive test, and they found that 30% of psychiatric patients were deficient in thiamine. Other studies have linked lower thiamine levels with depression in older adults. This was a Chinese study, so it's in the Chinese population in particular. There's even some limited research indicating that thiamine supplementation can improve depressive symptoms and even anxiety symptoms. And that would make sense given the large role of thiamine related to metabolism and how active our brains are and need so much glucose. Another population that's particularly susceptible to thiamine deficiency is the elderly. And studies have found that up to 50% of community-dwelling elderly individuals were thiamine deficient, and this is despite consuming more than the recommended daily intake of thiamine. Other studies looking at hospitalized elderly individuals found that the incidence of thiamine deficiency ranges from 20% to 40%. And this is based on testing using the transketolase test and also the mass spec liquid chromatography whole blood analysis, red blood cell analysis. So overall, these studies highlight the critical need for the awareness and intervention in cases where it is low regarding thiamine deficiency, and that it can show up in different populations. It's not necessarily going to be isolated in certain individuals, although the populations mentioned here should be the areas to look first. So whether you're a little bit overweight or have diabetes or have some sort of psychiatric problem like depression, anxiety, or you're just getting a little bit more advanced in your age, thiamine deficiency is more common than most of us have been led to believe. And ensuring that you're consuming adequate amounts is probably the first step you should take, because this nutrient is very important for health of our brains and the health of all of our tissues, because our bodies, our tissues, our cells need energy. And if you're having symptoms that mimic thiamine deficiency, well, it's a good thing to get tested for. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of the reality behind thiamine deficiency. If you have questions about anything noted in this video, drop them in the comments section. That's why I do the videos, to help you better understand what's going on with your health and with your body. If you want a more customized, usable answer, consider joining the membership program. We'll have more time and attention to dedicate to your questions. Now, one question you might have after watching this video is, what are the symptoms of thiamine deficiency? Well, they can be things like fatigue, mood changes, even digestive issues can sometimes be linked with thiamine deficiency. In this video here, you might find useful in exploring more of those symptoms. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.